Today we're talking about degassing, how you need to accommodate for it to get a good result during brewing. There's a couple of big drivers that you need to consider when you're going to brew coffee, and those are how dark or light your coffee is roasted. So roast degree is one of the largest drivers of the amount of gas that might be in your coffee. And when I say gas, I mean carbon dioxide. The second is going to be the age of your coffee. So how long ago it was roasted. And this is because the coffee naturally is dissipating and releasing gas over time. So how long it's been since roast is a critical metric as well. And then the third is the context that you're brewing in. The way that you're actually brewing the coffee can make this a bigger or smaller factor to getting a successful result. So we're going to cover all three. So the first thing that we had talked about is roast degree. When you roast coffee, there are a myriad of chemical changes that occur, and carbon dioxide is actually created and released during the roasting process from the bean itself. So a lot of the CO2 that's created, and it's not just CO2, but it's predominantly CO2, a lot of this is created and also released during roasting. It's extremely dynamic. The amount of degassing that occurs over the lifespan of the roasted coffee is going to be greatest right at the beginning. So yes, there's a lot of degassing that happens during roasting. It's also producing gas during the roasting process itself. And so when you're done, the majority of your degassing is going to occur within the first 24 hours. This is true of whole bean. It's also true of ground coffee, but I'm referring to whole bean at the moment. And I want to make a comment that most of your favorite roasters and anybody who's knowledgeable about this understands that you need to actually rest your coffee before you put it into any packaging. A lot of coffee packaging has one-way degas valves, and this is specifically to accommodate this dynamic. Even still, it's degassing so quickly that if you were to put it in packaging right after roasting, it could even burst. So 12 to 24 hours of resting your coffee after roasting is very common. That's how aggressive this degassing process is. So you can imagine that it's something that's quite important to pay attention to when you go to enjoy your coffee. I had mentioned that CO2 is created from the roasting process itself. So the more that you roast, the higher the CO2 content. That means the darker you roast, the more CO2 content you have. There's a funny little inverse relationship that's happening though, because the darker that you roast, the more that you expand and break down the cell structure of the coffee bean itself. That's why, for those of you who are familiar with roasting, there's a first crack, and if you go quite dark, a second crack as well. And this is the heat expanding the cellular structure of the bean so much that it fractures, and it releases a lot of moisture and gas, and it'll do this up to 2 times. Most specialty coffee roasters go a little bit past first crack for optimal sensory flavors, but it still stands that the darker you roast, the more gas you produce. And the darker you roast, the less dense your coffee is, which means it'll degas faster. So you create more, but you also release it faster in a dark roast. The inverse is true for a light roast, and of course, our favorite medium roast straddle the two. So if you have a very dark roasted coffee, you're going to have the majority of the degassing occur within the first 24 hours, like any roast. But even at the 20 or 30-day mark, it's not fully degassed as whole bean. In fact, at room temperature, whole bean takes around 5 to 6 weeks to fully degas. When you're talking about the difference in degassing rate between a dark, medium, and light roast, a medium roast is going to degas about half the rate of a dark roast, and a light roast is going to degas at a quarter of the rate, or 4 times slower, the medium roast being twice as slow. So that's how much roast degree impacts the rate of degassing in whole beans. This is why many modern coffees, even with really classic processing methods, which in my view take a little bit less time to hit optimal flavors, they're still going to recommend that you rest your coffee for up to 4 to 6 weeks. And we've all had good coffees beyond this. Yes, flavors mellow out, but if you've adequately packaged it, and this also means nitro flushing your packaging to remove oxygen to avoid oxidation, which can be a huge barrier to getting good flavors later in a coffee's life. If you do these things, you're going to be able to get a good result at 2 months and beyond. But the sweet spot is probably in that 6 week period. So next, we're going to talk about the storage conditions of your coffee. So I had already mentioned that when you're resting whole bean coffee, it's not fully degassed at a month, regardless of roast degree, but it is at around the 5 to 6 week mark. And this is true of whole bean. So when you grind your coffee, it degasses 10 times faster. And there is gas release that can only be released during the grinding process. So even if you are at this 5 to 6 week mark where results would show that you fully degassed your whole bean coffee, you'll still get some gas release during the grinding event itself, which is conducive to good crema and some liveliness in your flavors. And there's a reason for this. There's two types of degassing that occur while you're preparing for brewing. Diffusion happens from the whole bean itself. The cells do allow for some escaping of CO2 through the outer perimeter of the bean, and this happens over this 5 to 6 week period, but it reaches the limit. At a certain point, the gas that's trapped in the coffee cells, more on the interior of the whole bean, just can't fight their way out through that cellular structure and properly degas. So when you grind and you shear all these particles, you allow for this to happen. And so there's always a release that happens from grinding coffee itself. And that can still lead to good flavors, adequate crema at these later resting stages. So that's some interesting dynamics between whole bean and ground coffee storage and degassing rates. When you grind your coffee, just like whole bean, the majority of the degassing happens in the first 24-hour period. Where whole bean takes 5 to 6 weeks to fully degas, ground coffee takes approximately 5 days. So it rapidly increases the degassing rate. Now, there's one other aspect of aging that I think is really interesting and fun to play around with, which is freezing your coffee. This isn't something that was always recommended within specialty coffee circles, but now it's common knowledge that if you freeze your coffee, you can get great tasting results and extend the shelf life and amount of time you have to enjoy that coffee without negatively impacting its flavor whatsoever. I've heard things that are comparative cuppings where they're nearly indistinguishable. And so while grinding has degassing happen really fast, fully happen in 5 days, whole bean slower than this, but fully degas in 5 to 6 weeks, freezing slows down the process by about 12 times compared to whole bean at room temperature. So this means that 1 day of degassing at room temperature is equivalent to 12 days in your common freezer. Or more excitingly, 1 month of degassing at room temperature is the equivalent to 1 year in the freezer. So if you have some really special coffees and you prepare them correctly for frozen storage, you can cellar these things and enjoy them for months and months and months. The only important thing to watch out for here is that when you pull them out of the freezer, you keep them in their bag. You do not open it for several hours until it's equilibrated to room temperature. This is going to ensure that you don't open it up and draw a bunch of moisture on there, and then that's going to negatively impact your flavor when you go to brew it. As long as you do those steps correctly, you can leverage freezing to really enjoy coffees at much longer than 6 weeks aging. So play around with that. Third, and lastly, is the context that you're brewing in, or your brew method. There's 3 major areas that we consider: immersion, drip or percolation, and the third, final boss, is espresso. These go from easy to hard. Easy because when you're doing immersion, you are soaking the coffee grinds in the water. It doesn't rely on water passing through a coffee bed in a set volume in a set amount of time and ensuring that you get in and get out of those coffee particles to get great tasting coffee. It doesn't work like that. It's static. It allows them to mingle for, in the case of cupping, as long as it's required to get a great result. If you're making a French press and you're pouring it out right after your 4 or 5 minute brew time, that's a little bit of a different story. And in that situation, you might have to grind a bit finer, provide more surface area to accommodate the fact that you're brewing with fresher coffee. But otherwise, immersion is pretty forgiving. Second is drip or percolation. This is where you have a fixed volume that needs to pass through a coffee bed. And this is definitely where aging starts to become much more of a factor. You'll typically hear people say that you need to wait at least 3 days, maybe more towards 1 week, depending on roast degree, to get a good result for drip coffee. This applies to both batch brewing cafes, automatic drip coffee makers at home, certainly manual brew methods like V60s. In those manual brew methods, you'll often see recipes that are suggesting a bloom. So depending on how fresh your coffee is, you might need to adjust the bloom step of your recipe. Either provide hotter water, more time to how long you wait during that bloom stage to apply the majority of your water, and you might also choose to apply more water and with it more thermal energy to liberate the gas out of the coffee bed before you proceed with the latter stages of brewing. Just like immersion, you might need to grind a little bit finer if your coffee is a bit fresher in order to get a successful result here. Third, espresso is the most challenging. It is still technically a percolation method, but it happens under pressure. But because the parameters of brewing are so aggressive when it comes to the amount of time allotted and the fact that even with properly degassed coffee, you're going to be using the finest particle size of all the brew methods out there, which means the smallest amount of space between the coffee particles for water to pass through or gas to come out of. It's very challenging, and you'll definitely notice that you need to pay attention to aging the most when it comes to brewing espresso. Modern espresso machines allow for the control of blooming, but in the context of espresso, they might call it saturating, and you can take the same steps that we had outlined for drip coffee, but you do so before you go on and apply the full volume and pressure of your brew water for espresso. Same principles are occurring, the difficulty level is simply higher. So it's very important to rest your coffee well for espresso. I don't think you can get a great result before the 1 week mark. And depending on all the other factors that we covered, you will likely see yourself waiting 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and you're gonna have to consider roast degree when you're thinking about the sweet spot for brewing espresso. Those are the 3 categories of brewing, how they relate to roast degree, degassing, and I'm extremely interested in your experience. So let me know what coffees you're enjoying, what brew methods you're enjoying them on, how degassing is a component of your brewing practices. If you like this video, hit the like, give me a subscribe. Let me know what you think down in the comments. I'm so excited to hear from you and how degassing factors in. Where we go from here is anyone's guess.